one of the lads was making the tea, as per usual, and the others were getting their bits and pieces together, security equipment, etc. The doorbell went at about 20 to 7, so I then went downstairs and saw Tony Black outside. He was on his own, so I opened up the door. He looked a little bit dishevelled, like he'd just got out of bed. His timekeeping wasn't one of the best.
No sooner he was upstairs, he said, "Oh, it's up time to go to the loo. I'm going down the stairs."
And all of a sudden there's an almighty commotion going on.
All bang, both over the head.
I could hear these tables and chairs being kicked over. This man running at me, holding a semi-automatic pistol in his hand. He was yelling at me in no uncertain terms to get down on the floor. And that's when I looked at Tony Black and I just said, "Who the blankety blank's he?"
They told me, "Do what you want or we'll burn you alive." And they've taken us down to the vaults.
They knew too much. They knew exactly what to do, where they were going. The main vault door is open, and inside there's 3 smaller safes. I've got the keys for the 3 safes, and Robin had got the combination.
The problem was I'd forgotten the numbers, and I just couldn't get in there. At some point it cut my hands.
And with that I was sort of roughly pushed back down onto the metal box, and the gun put in my ear again. In front of the 3 safes I noticed a couple of pallets with gold bullion boxes on.
Fuck you.
Nothing left to make me feel small. Luck has left me standing so tall. Gold, always believe in your soul. You've got the power to know you're indestructible. Always believe it, 'cause you are gold. Like that you're bound to return. There's something I could have learned. You're indestructible. Always believe it. After the rush
You good?
is gone, I hope you find it.
Got my stomach there. Fact that I need to go to the gym and so on. Good, let's go. Okay. The Brinks-Mat story is interesting for a few reasons, not least of which just the sheer amount of gold. 26 million pounds in 1983, which is equivalent to like 100 million pounds or 118 million dollars in today's money. So it was enormous, an enormous robbery. On top of that, it is still to this day the largest gold bullion heist and potentially the largest gold heist in history. But I think what sets it apart is just the characters in this story, as well as what became known as the curse of the gold afterwards, and this real kind of back and forth between the police and criminals that went on. And it's just a fantastic story and a tragic story as well. There's a lot of people hurt, a lot of murders, there's a lot of people who lost money and so on in this, and that's not even to mention the trauma that the security guards went through. But it is nonetheless an absolutely incredible story that I think is one that needs to be told again, especially to perhaps younger audiences that wouldn't be aware of things like the Great Train Robbery or Brinks-Mat for that matter.
Britain's biggest ever robbery. Gold bars were stolen near Heathrow Airport.
Shortly before 7 o'clock this morning, men carrying guns and wearing balaclava helmets burst in. They handcuffed the 6 guards on duty and doused them with petrol.
The biggest ever robbery in British criminal history.
The bullion thieves forced their way into the top security depot beneath the Heathrow flight path just after 6 o'clock this morning.
One of the most
audacious robberies ever carried out in Britain.
The thieves then moved 6,800 bars of pure gold, each one weighing 1 or 2 kilos, about 3 tons in all.
That's 26 million pounds worth of gold stolen in Britain's biggest ever robbery.
The police are not saying how the men got into the depot, whether the security cameras were working.
In a large and well-organised operation. Even allowing for inflation, the haul is twice as big as the Great Train Robbery.
The latest suggestion is that the gold has been melted down already and has actually been taken out of the country.
The operation is moving so quickly that senior officers now feel they're closing the net on the men they believe to be the brains behind Britain's biggest robbery.
The gang escaped with £26 million worth of gold bars, weighing nearly 3 tons.
The security firm thought the building was bandit-proof.
They thought they'd gone in for £2 million. What they saw was 13 times that.
Stumbled across 3 tons of gold bullion. That is the equivalent of around £100 million in today's money. 6,800 gold bars were stolen in total, packed into 76 cardboard boxes.
It's one of the biggest ever armed robberies in world history. I think the previous largest figure related to the war and to priceless works of art being stolen by fleeing Nazis at the end of the war. So the parallels aren't really there.
The Brinks-Mat warehouse was quite simply one of the biggest safes in Britain. It was on the outskirts of Heathrow, the big international airport outside London.
It was one of the most secure buildings in Britain, containing 3 of the world's toughest safes.
This was a huge amount of gold. To give some sort of perspective, it was the weight of 2 average family saloon motor cars.
But within 24 hours of Britain's biggest armed robbery, shockwaves are felt all over the world.
So much gold had suddenly been stolen and taken off the market. The value of gold in general was going up even faster than usual.
The gold bullion itself belonged to a company called Matthey, which was enormous, and it was founded in 1817 or 1820, if I remember correctly, and it was one of the largest operators of gold in the UK and was a massive operator worldwide. Remember that this is 1983, and worldwide the gold reserve had only been kind of removed, I think it was 1971. And that meant that up until just a decade before, if you printed any money, you needed to have gold somewhere to back it up. So Matthey was enormous, and a lot of countries still hadn't quite moved to the fiat currency model where the dollar just backed up whatever you printed. So gold being shipped around the country and around the world was a big deal at the time. And Matthey was one of the kind of big 4 or 5 companies, especially in the UK, doing that at the time. So they probably wouldn't have been delighted that the gold was missing, and they spent the entire day afterwards having all of their brokers call every customer who was waiting on the gold to give them the bad news.
I remember one customer calling, shipment was going to Singapore, he just said to me, Simon, our gold didn't arrive. And I said, no John, you're right, it didn't, and it's not going to. And there was a sort of a pause on the end of the phone, and I just suddenly heard this,
On top of which Lloyd's insurance had to be called, and they also likely didn't have a great day as the gold was fully insured.
The client still wanted his gold. Lloyd's insurance had to pay out the money to replace the missing 6,800 bars.
And all of this mounted even further pressure on an already pressurized police force to go and find this gold and the people responsible, because with that level of gold being stolen and the amount of effect it had on the economy, remember just a day later, once it was announced, the price of gold itself had gone up by £1 to £2 million. That's how big of an effect this had on the market overall. So all of that meant that Margaret Thatcher and her government at the time were mounting enormous pressure on the Met Police to go and figure out who had done this.
It was the most valuable and the biggest robbery we'd dealt with.
And that meant that Scotland Yard, which is the headquarters for the police in the UK, put their best squad on top of it, and the flying squad were called in. These were specially trained for armed robbery investigations.
When we arrived at the scene, it was a warehouse type situation. When you got up to the first floor where the control room was and where the guards' restroom was, it was in complete disarray. There were chairs turned over, there was a strong smell of petrol.
The police were really up against it though. Remember, this is 1983. There's no DNA to go on. You know, you have fingerprints, but These are professional criminals. They know it inside and out. So you're not at a time where you can look for hair fibers, DNA samples, saliva, anything like that. So the police really were up against it here. And on top of that, these guys were wearing gloves, obviously, but also, to make matters worse, there was only one external camera, and that was facing away from the doors. So you weren't even catching the vehicle or anything useful on camera there either, which they likely knew.
Detectives were back at the scene today, but they admit they face a difficult task. The gang were clearly highly professional and organised. The gold was marked, but the chances are it's already been melted down.
And on top of that, there was no forced entry, which gave police a pretty good inkling that there was either someone on the inside or that these guys knew their way around this building more than anyone really should.
I went up in a helicopter with another chap, thinking that the gold would be stashed fairly quickly.
Or with Heathrow nearby, it could have been out of the country within hours. It's not much to go on.
Those boxes will weigh each in the region of 100 weight.
All of this culminated into the police being adamant that there was an inside man. Either one of the guards on duty at the time, someone in Johnson Matthey, or someone at Brinks-Mat that had told these guys exactly what they would expect going into the job.
When we arrived, the guards were obviously very distressed by the whole situation.
To be honest, it's one day I wish I'd never gone to work.
The first theory in a case of that magnitude is there must have been an inside agent. We looked into their family history and we tried to prove a link to someone that would be capable of committing this type of robbery.
And that led to a huge investigation of all of the staff working that day, with Michael Scouse, the supervisor and key holder, the kind of boss of the guard team at the time, being a key suspect.
Their houses were searched, certain items would have been taken, they would have been interrogated quite forcibly to see if they were involved.
Instead of being taken to the hospital, I was taken up to Hounslow police station, where they took off all my clothing for forensics.
Scouse was under investigation for several days, and it culminated in the flying squad arresting him on suspicion of being involved in this robbery.
One would ask me a question and then I would try and answer it, and then one of the others would jump in and said, 5 minutes ago you said. So then my brain would start to backtrack, what did I say 5 minutes ago? Somebody had set me up.
At the time I was a member of a rifle and pistol club in London. So obviously being the supervisor that day, I'm the chief suspect.
What was really interesting in this case was that the police tried to do something that they hadn't done before, something new, which was they filmed all of the guards as they brought them through the warehouse once again and asked them to detail everything that had gone on that morning.
I then came down here, pushed this door open, and then the door shut behind me. I identified Tony Black there. I opened up the door.
As far as you are aware, were you the first person to be brought down by the robbers?
During the raid, yes.
And this was to try and catch out anything that would seem out of place or catch them in a lie. And it was a new tactic that did work out quite well for the flying squad.
For about half an hour, I tried to set these, but I had forgotten the numbers. And during that half an hour, I was threatened more or less with everything, from being changed sex to being stabbed or scarred or whatever.
So I just came here. Then Mick came in, had a few minutes, then he went out into there.
Hang on a minute.
So quickly, this new tactic shone a big light on one of the guards, Tony Black.
It became quite obvious that his evidence was flawed.
I then went downstairs to the toilet.
Did you say that was your intention, 21, or did you just...
No, I just went down to the toilet. I can remember sort of seeing someone in the background. You know, it wasn't sort of clear, but he was someone in the background.
From where you were standing, could you see the shutters open?
No, I was looking in the corner, like.
Are you standing in exactly the same position as you were in?
I think I may have even been closer because I was doing it like that rather than like that, so it must have been about here.
He ended up with his nose up against the wall, and just an impossible position. He had to get right in the corner, otherwise he had to see what was going on downstairs. And
if it wasn't enough that Tony Black already looked horrendously guilty on camera and just gave some strange answers to everything, the police also took his diary, so his journal that he had to mark things, and photocopied it and then put it back into place so that he wouldn't know they had moved anything around, and then found later on when they went to question him about the diary that he had changed some entries in the journal, and when they showed him the photocopy of it, he seemed quite flummoxed, and they quickly made him kind of fall apart once they pointed out that on the day of the robbery he had marked the time 6:30, and when they asked him what this was about, he said, well, this is just the time I'm arriving at work. But the police then pointed out, well, that is the only day that you noted the time you went to work at, and it's pretty suspicious that that is the one time when you would write this. So this had him on edge as it is.
And this seemed to have a pretty dramatic effect on the situation. He was obviously taken aback by this.
And then they found a key link between Black and some serious criminals.
His sister was living with and was the common law wife of a man called Robinson.
And once that was pointed out, Tony Black crumbled fairly quickly under pressure, and he then gave up 3 names. And this was Brian Robinson, his brother-in-law, Tony White, and Mickey McAvoy.
Black is not a professional criminal.
Tony was quite an affable sort of chap. He was a bit of a chatty lad, but never cut out to be an armed robber. He would meet with Robinson and McAvoy after he came out of work at night. The plan was that once there was a good haul in there, he would phone Robinson and he would say, let's go fishing tonight.
My late father went to his grave cursing Tony Black for what he did to me, did to my other colleagues and their families and friends.
Black would have been looking over his shoulder 24/7 because he'd just put the block on one of the greatest robberies that has ever happened.
This all meant that now the police had someone to chase. And they were fairly sure that these were definitely the caliber of people who would be involved, because they were really not nice people.
The robbers on that team aren't nice people. Some armed robbers, some professional criminals can be charismatic and interesting people, and it would be wrong to deny it. It would be just as wrong to deny that they're people who are quite prepared to put both barrels of a sawn-off through you if you stand between them and the prize. And yet you do get the ironies of a moment occur as they got into their van to drive away with their £26 million. One of them turned to the trussed-up guards and called, "Merry Christmas, lads."
Michael McAvoy was known to the Criminal Intelligence Branch, was known to the Flying Squad, and was strongly suspected of being deeply involved in armed robberies.
The Flying Squad put together a crack team of the best police they could find, jumped into their vans and swatted up, and went out at the crack of dawn to bring these guys in, and managed to catch all 3 of them napping, chasing them just outside their house.
And took them to 3 separate police stations.
We arrest Robinson and McAvoy and White 10 days after the armed robbery. We charge the 3 men with committing armed robbery and conspiracy to rob Brinks-Mat Gold Bullion.
Unfortunately, arresting them may have been the easiest part, because now they were on the hunt to find as much evidence as possible.
At that time, you interviewed them. They didn't have to have a solicitor. In some cases, there were some solicitors that you would refuse to let in, because you knew that if you let a solicitor in, he would be straight out and tell everybody else what was going on.
And while Tony Black clearly had made a huge error in judgment and committed a serious crime, he did make the brave decision of turning state's evidence, as they call it, and essentially becoming a full witness in the case.
Black would have to go and touch the likes of McAvoy on the shoulder and identify him as being involved in the Brinks-Mat robbery. And as Black approached him to touch him on the shoulder, he hit Black full in the face. Now that was intimidation, but thankfully Black came through that.
Tony Black was an enormous asset to the police. He brought them through all of the kind of lead up to the crime itself and described that they would meet up, go fishing as he talked them through all the elements, got keys cut for them and so on. And Tony Black became basically the key asset for the police in this entire investigation.
Robinson and McAvoy were very, very hard men, right? Ruthless, right? And they'd let nothing stand in their way. They was very experienced in what they'd done and carried out the job absolutely perfect.
Being a witness in this case wasn't exactly easy, as associates of the three criminals. Remember, these are big South London criminals at the time, used everything they could to try and intimidate witnesses to back down and kind of figure out a way to get the case just thrown out the window.
My girlfriend received a letter, and so did my mum. And one lives in Sheerness and the other one lives in Gravesend. They said the same thing. If Robin doesn't tell the truth, Oscar will leave him. And because my girlfriend and I knew exactly what that meant. Now, Oscar was a pet name for my penis. So yeah, it was extremely scary stuff.
They had to be in his house to know this. And he was really, really unnerved by the whole thing and was on the verge of not giving any more evidence.
I was really close to saying, well, sod you, you didn't look after me.
When I explained to him if we did that, we could possibly lose Robinson altogether, he was quite adamant then he would go ahead. A very brave decision he made.
As the trials began, McAvoy and Robinson went pretty straightforward, pretty to the point, and they were both given the maximum 25-year sentences for armed robbery.
Two men who were part of the gang which robbed the Brinks-Mat warehouse of gold have each been sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Tony Black, for his part in the crime, wasn't obviously let away with it, but because he turned state's evidence and decided to help the police, his sentence was knocked down to just 6 years in prison.
After that, I presume he got a change of identity and is under the witness protection scheme somewhere.
I think what really shows the level of criminal we're talking about here in South London at the time isn't even the going to prison or the crime itself. I think the best evidence of that is that there was a couple of prison break attempts at the prison for McAvoy, and at one point a helicopter actually flew nearby, but the police had gotten a tip that they were going to try and land the helicopter into the prison and break McAvoy out, so they were able to kind of swat that away. But these were really serious criminals, and there was a lot of attempts to try and get these guys out.
The jury felt that one of the defendants was not guilty.
Tony White, though, would get off on a technicality, unlike the others.
At one of White's interviews after he was arrested, he was alleged to have been shown Black's original statement, and having read it twice, he then, according to the police officers, had made admissions that basically this was correct. If he had read the statement, which he completely denied, that those pages of the statement would be covered in his fingerprints.
The officer said, "Look, I'm not going to insult your intelligence. I know you will not tell us anything, nor will the other two. You have never nicked old Bill before, so I know you won't nick your own. We want that gold back, and we don't care how we get it. It can be left on a motor or anywhere. We don't care if we don't nick anyone else. As long as we get it back, we don't care." I said, "I've told you, I don't know anything about it." He said, "Let me tell you, you three will be nicked for this and fitted up. We will make sure you get a long sentence. That's why we aren't making any notes at all, because if we get any help from you or the other two, we can write this up as we want. You know what we can do. You know the power we've got."
Now, the committal proceedings lasted for 3 days, and throughout the whole of that period, they were allegedly looking for this statement and unable to locate it, which was highly suspicious.
So White managed to walk away scot-free.
It's the first time the Old Bailey's ever been in session on a Sunday. The judge, David Tudor Price, took this unprecedented step after the jury said last night they needed more time to consider.
Tony Black was detained in secret for the length of his 6 years. No one knew where he went, under what name, anything like that. And when he got out, he was given a brand new identity and life, as he would have been seriously under threat if anyone knew where he ended up.
After the conviction of gang leaders Robinson, McAvoy and Supergrass Tony Black, Scotland Yard detectives desperately needed to track the missing gold.
What is crazy though is after all of this, the arrests, the chase down, Tony Black and all of it, the police were still no closer to the other 3 armed robbers who were there that day, and even more importantly, because of mounting pressure, police were no closer to getting the gold.
No gold had been found in a year following the robbery. So the flying squad teams took up a refocused investigation with this in mind.
This was putting enormous pressure on Scotland Yard, who had set up a specific task force for this to hunt down that gold, because the Home Office and the government in general was quite concerned that a lot of this money could end up funding drugs and other criminal activities.
The thought was, we've got to get this money out of circulation. We cannot leave the money out there for the villains to reinvest.
Publication of a fairly substantial reward produced piles and files and files and files of the most bizarre claims. Neighbours were complaining about their neighbours digging in the garden at dead of night, and they thought they were burying the gold. People were coming along with lodestones and pendulums and maps and saying they could point to where the gold was, even down to one person claiming that extraterrestrials were telling him where the gold was.
Where did the gold go when it left Heathrow? Well, I think a lot of people would like to know. It was probably laid down for a few days.
Gold bars, like the paper money whose value they support, carry their own serial numbers. That identity had to be erased.
The problem for the criminals was they weren't able to just turn this gold into cash, so they now had a huge task to disguise this as scrap gold in order to get it back into the market and turn it into cash, and that's where the police would start hunting.
The only way that gold is acceptable, really, coming back into the market, is if it's sold into the market as scrap gold.
The man put in charge of this task force was a police legend, a man called Brian Boyce, and his legendary status had come from the fact that he was one of the head police who put the cuffs on Reggie Cray, one of the Cray twins, folk legends in London, especially back then, but there's been movies made about these guys. And Brian Boyce was essentially one of the lead guys who took these down, a military man who'd been in World War II, and he was made head of the task force and seen as the right person who would fight through any corruption or police problems to take these guys down.
They were certainly clever people, and we mustn't underestimate them, and I certainly don't. I believe they knew they were going to get a large amount of gold, and certainly from the inquiries that I've made, they were soon able to deal with that gold. So yes, they were well organised. I do believe they expected a large amount of gold. Whether they expected quite the amount they got, I couldn't say.
So the police knew that the gold would now need to be turned into cash. And to do that, it would have to go through a process of being disguised, serials being removed and turned into scrap gold. And the hunt down that line led police onto the next key figure and one of the main players in this crime.
Gold is no good to robbers. What they want is money.
Once anonymous, the bars could be sold. The robbers knew of a likely customer. Earlier, he'd organised a similar exercise in criminal alchemy, making gold ingots out of smuggled gold coins. The enterprise had netted him £5 million and a reputation as a reliable fence of stolen gold.
It was to Charterhouse Japhet Bank in Jersey that a Kent businessman had come in the summer of 1984, wanting to buy £100,000 worth of gold bars.
It later transpired that he wasn't necessarily after the gold bars themselves, but he was after the documentation that went with those gold bars.
Having bought that gold, he put it in a carrier bag which they had to give him, and he walked out of the bank carrying £100,000 worth of gold when the deal was finished under his arm and disappeared out onto the street. He went round the corner, opened another bank account, got himself a deposit box and put those gold bars there.
So that he could move 11 gold bars from the Bullion robbery around at any one time.
Then he flew back to London that same day.
The bank official finds his behaviour very suspicious, so he decides to contact the police.
This man was Kenneth Noye, and Kenny Noye essentially had an upbringing that might as well have been a full-on schooling in the world of crime.
They moved into a classic suburb of southeast London where a lot of criminally inclined people, frankly, moved to at that time.
Ken would always, have an answer for anything that was thrown at him. He'd always come back with something.
The mod subculture of the early 60s is very, very important. It's part of a long line of sharp London dandyish jack-the-lads.
He already had a scooter that was the best around, which was Ken.
Sometime later on, when he sold his scooter, he was the first one that could afford a car, which was far beyond anything, we could afford. It was a job running a scooter in those days.
What his friends didn't know was that Ken was stealing cars and scooters and selling them on. In April 1967, at Bexley Crown Court, 19-year-old Noye was found guilty of 10 charges of theft and sentenced to a year at Borstal.
Borstals were very, very rigorous, highly disciplined, militaristic, quite brutal institutions. I think you can see that pretty much as a finishing school for any 19-year-old just getting involved in a career of crime.
Kenny Noye learned that handling the produce of crimes was far more sensible than actually taking part in them. And that was a turning point for him.
Neighbours were surprised when he bought Hollywood Cottage, a run-down listed building on 7 acres of land. Weeks later, it mysteriously burned to the ground. Noye claimed on the insurance and built a mock Tudor replacement. The term cottage was absurd.
This guy was your classic English Jack-the-Lad chancer, the guy who kind of knew how to work every system.
The swimming pool was heated by electricity tapped from the main supply out on the road.
He really loved the life of crime from everything I've read and seen about him. I mean, apparently when you walked into his living room, the Goldfinger soundtrack would automatically play. And he even joined the Freemasons, which was kind of a secret society of police and upper class officials in England in order to help him get away with crimes if he ever got in trouble.
He just wanted to be something special, yeah. And he told you somehow he would do it. And of course, in a way, he was right. I wouldn't trust Kenneth Noye as far as I could see him.
He was very, very good at what he did and crucially knew exactly how the systems worked in the world and therefore how to play those systems.
He's a good operator.
He's a very clever businessman. He enjoys doing business deals. But the actual doing the deal was, I think, what he got most of the kick out of. He's had money for years. It's ridiculous to say that he's only just got it since the Brinks-Mat.
He's his own person. He's not a mastermind. He's not some big gangster. He's not the things that they're making him out to be. He's worked hard for what he's got. They've made him into something, some big crook, big time man, and he isn't any of these things. He just isn't. He's just a normal family man who is a workaholic and he enjoys making money. If something comes along cheap, then he's bought it, like the majority of the public would do.
My impression was that Noye was a very intelligent criminal. He was manipulative and he was ruthless. He offered me £1 million, and I refused it.
He is the criminal yuppie. He'd be the inside dealer.
So police were already fairly suspicious of Noye, but then they got their big break that would link him directly to the Brinks-Mat crimes.
In early December 1984, we get a phone call from a man in Hatton Garden, and a gentleman has walked in there wanting to buy a smelter to smelt gold.
This would have been an ideal opportunity to put a tracking device in the smelter. I mean, it's full of electrical equipment anyway, so a tracking device would never have been noticed by the criminals, even if they'd looked. We could have sat back and waited for them to get the smelter to its home, and then we could have waited till they started up doing the smelting and crash bang wallop. We'd found them, we'd found where the gold was. It wasn't done.
Two men loaded an industrial gold smelter into the back of a Rolls-Royce and headed for Kent. What the men didn't know is that they were being watched by an undercover police team.
We left there, followed by us, and we came back to Dartford doing it sometimes about 100 miles an hour. He was all right in his big Rolls Royce, but with our little Ford, we were having trouble keeping up with him. He came out of his house about 9 in the morning, jumped into the Rolls Royce and drove off.
Brian Reeder, as it turns out, was the go-between taking the gold from Noye to the process of being smelted and turned into cash. And this put the pieces together to where they found out why those 11 gold bar receipts were so important.
Reeder was calling at Noye's premises on a almost daily basis. And every time these two met, we ascertained that a very heavy bag was going from Noye to Reeder.
The handovers were made in consignments of 11 bars at a time.
Complete with 11 receipts, which of course Kenneth Noye got from that bank in Jersey. Those receipts are then sent back to Noye so he can reuse them for another 11 ingots that he's planning to deliver to them later.
The police were watching, but stayed their hand. They wanted to follow Reeder to see where the gold trail would lead.
But this did lead them on to a small Bristol scrap gold business called Scadlin, who police quickly discovered were the link which were turning the gold into cash for these criminals.
It was their job to then mix it with base metal, copper, brass, to give it the appearance, if they could, of scrap gold.
To make this entire story even crazier, it turns out that Johnson and Matthey themselves were buying their own gold back.
It paid the market rate for what, unknown to the bank, was its own adulterated property.
Now, a huge amount of cash, obviously, would be generated by disposing of this amount of gold.
So now the police had their scrap gold dealer, and this also led them onto the bank accounts where the cash was going through. And now they had some sort of kind of chain to pull on to chase the cash down.
Somewhere along the line, that gold had to be turned into money. It had to get into the legitimate gold market, and that was the function of Scadlins.
Scadlins advertised throughout Britain for the right sort of base metals to melt with the Brinks-Mat bars, so that their priceless identity could be debased and disguised.
And all of this led them to John Palmer, the man who they believed was taking the gold itself and turning it from pure gold into scrap gold.
The gold was taken to a country house not far away, the home of a local jeweller and a former director of Scadlins. In the grounds, screened by trees, there was a small iron hut with a smelter in it. About half the haul, £13 million worth, was melted down in the hut. Gold is a unique commodity. 90% of all the gold ever mined is still in circulation. Gold market experts know where most of it is at any one time. They certainly notice when vast lumps of it, however camouflaged, blunder in and out of the market. Whatever the suspicions, legitimate bullion dealers did buy the crude ingots forged in John Palmer's shed.
The brazenness of these criminals cannot be overstated. They actually took the gold to the assay office, which was one of the 4 places in the UK which could register gold onto the legitimate market. It can't be overstated how ballsy that is to take stolen gold to an actual government registered registry office. It was insane, insane.
10 kilos of melted gold, around about 40% purity. And this is very similar to the Brinks-Mat gold.
And it turns out that there was a van full of gold showing up every morning over the period of weeks and months outside the assay office at dawn. And the assay office did have some serious suspicions. At points, there was even coins sticking out of the gold. And at one point, they found gold so badly melted that a lump of pure gold actually fell off of it. So there was huge suspicions inside the assay office.
Well, we thought it was very strange. We did think things. But when customers register with us, it's completely confidential.
So once the gold was registered, this meant that Scadlin could then sell that gold into the legitimate market, and big buyers like Johnson and Matthey themselves were actually just buying it up. And then the cash and the transfers of payments from these gold sales were all going through a small Bristol bank account with huge sums of money. And this would give the police their next real lead.
So in order to assist this or facilitate this, the bank had to send to London to get vast or large injections of cash to their operation in Bedminster, Bristol. We found out that a lot of this money was brand new £50 notes.
There was so much cash going through and being requested out of this small branch of Barclays in Bristol that they had to order cash from London more or less every day.
I used to agree on a daily basis with the directors how much money they were going to withdraw. This enabled me, because we didn't have that sort of cash in stock, this enabled me to order the cash from the bank's cash centre. In those days you couldn't disclose to the authorities, to the police, any details of a customer's account.
And there was nearly £1 million a day at one point going out of that branch. But the police couldn't really do anything about that. However, all of the bills that passed through here were £50 notes and all started with the A24 serial number. And that gave police a great way to track any cash going forward. In total, the head of Scotland, Garrett Chappell, pulled £11 million in cash out of that Barclays branch over the course of this job. And his cut of this was the VAT that he would claim back from the government. These were really brazen criminals. The police now, though, had enough to go in and search John Palmer's residence, his estate.
Police circled the mansion and blocked off all the exits. They knew that Palmer was associated with Scadlins and suspected his part in the gold chain. But Palmer wasn't there. The police began a thorough search of the house and the grounds for evidence of a link.
And they found a fair amount of evidence that would make them pretty sure that John Palmer was definitely involved in the Brinks-Mat gold smelting and recovery and laundering.
Police raided 36 addresses, one of them John Palmer's house near Bath. They searched the grounds but found nothing. In the house, they found 2 gold bars, still warm, stuffed down the side of a sofa.
Scouring the grounds, the police had soon discovered the corrugated iron shed in the scrub and, inside, the smelter. It was still warm. 2 men found hiding nearby admitted they'd been working at the smelter that night. Towards dusk, the furnace was taken off for forensic analysis.
There were, in fact, 2 bars of gold there that were still warm, that had just come from the smelter.
And also a selection of firearms.
Unfortunately, John Palmer wasn't in residence at the time.
Palmer, though, was a slippery sort who had, luckily, by absolute coincidence, been convinced by his wife to take a break from all of the hard work he'd been doing to go to Tenerife a few days before they searched the house. And when police arrived, he was happily sitting on holiday on one of the Spanish Isles.
By pure coincidence, Palmer had taken off for the Canary Islands on a family holiday 3 days earlier. Alerted by the skirmish at battlefields, the press descended on Tenerife.
Tenerife and Spain at the time had no extradition with the UK, and usually police could be paid off in that area to not send criminals back. So a lot of criminals would head to Tenerife and the south coast of Spain to hide away from the British police, and it became known as the Costa del Crime.
He was a money launderer, he was an extortionist, he was involved with some of the worst armed robbers in London.
At one point, he even appeared next to the Queen on the Sunday Times rich list with an estimated fortune of £300 million.
When he was on the rich list, richer than the Queen.
He laughed. As he said, papers don't tell the truth all the time, do they?
What did you think of it?
Rubbish. Rubbish.
The BBC headed out there to see if they could catch John Palmer and get a glimpse of him. And they ended up getting far more than they expected, as Kate Addy actually got a sit-down interview with John Palmer, who you would assume would be in hiding out by the pool in a hotel resort. He seemingly had no problem talking to the press.
I simply had a message, urgent messages to ring home. I rang home and I was simply told the police had smashed into my house, arrested the people that were looking after the house. That was the message I had. I was completely astonished and amazed.
Did you know, or could you think of any reason for this happening?
At first, I couldn't think of any reason. I was amazed, and then they told me it was connected with some bullion robbery, and I was just amazed. I feel that the police have overreacted. I understand they carried out SAS type of raids at my property.
The police have apparently looked at a small smelting works which are in the grounds of your house.
We have a smelting works which was put there some approximately 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years ago. This works was connected with my former business.
And you do claim to be completely innocent and have no connection with the matters which the police are investigating?
I'm completely innocent, and nobody that I'm connected with, I believe, knows anything about it too. I'm in no hurry to go back. I'll take my time and go back when I'm ready, and not when Scotland Yard's ready.
In the end, though, time ran out for Palmer, or rather, it ran out for Palmer's passport. He'd forgotten to check the expiry date, so 18 months after he'd begun his holiday, Palmer was ordered off the island. He flew to Rio de Janeiro, but the Brazilian authorities too were concerned that he didn't have a valid passport and put him on a flight back to London.
And finally returned to face trial for handling the stolen gold at the Old Bailey in 1987, 4 years after the robbery.
At his Old Bailey trial, John Palmer said Scadlins had used him.
In the trial, John Palmer managed to convince the jury that he had simply no idea where the gold was coming from, and that he was just doing a job and saw an opportunity, and he convinced them. And as he walked out, he blew the jury a kiss, and from then on was given the name John Goldfinger Palmer.
I was melting gold, but innocently. Never.
John was in shock, and both of us were extremely frightened. But he had, and of course I had the children, which made things a million times worse.
So John,
yes, he was white, shaking.
As pressure mounted on the police, the decision was made to put more and more scrutiny on Noye and see if they could catch the last of the gold red-handed with someone before it was all completely gone. They knew time wasn't really on their side anymore.
The top-level decision was to take the bullion out of circulation so that it couldn't finance further serious crime.
It caused a certain rift between officers of my rank and my team because we were firmly of the opinion that we wanted to run this for some weeks and get the whole gang as opposed to one piece of it. A decision was taken in the higher echelons of Scotland Yard to insert officers into Noye's premises to discover if Noye had any other gold buried or hidden. We had to enlist the help of rural SAS trained officers.
On January the 26th, Murphy was sent into the grounds of Hollywood Cottage with his partner John Fordham.
All we did was follow major criminals. That's what my job was, nothing else. Didn't do ordinary police work. But when we did this job, I think everybody was sort of, no, who's Kenneth Noye? Nobody knew who he was.
John Fordham and Neil Murphy went into the grounds of Kenneth Noye's property.
Car turns up, we've only been half an hour, car goes in, made our way right up quite close to the house, just about getting to the area where we want to be. Probably wanted to be a little bit closer. Certainly about as far as you can see here, we were up there and in the woods. And the dogs started to bark. It seemed obvious to me that there's no point in staying here. Dogs are making too much noise. Let's just get out. So I indicated to John, sort of a, come on, let's go, and come back later. So I moved away quite calmly. There's no panic. There's no people coming or anything like that. And came to a fence, which is the border of Noye's ground. Started to climb out, and I could hear noises then. Torches flashing like through the woods. And it's obvious that they were near where we were before that. And I was a little bit worried about John, just a bit. I just assumed he was with me here somewhere, making his way out. But I could see three figures who we know now was Mrs. Noye and Kenneth Noye and John Reader, and they were standing over John. It's silly now when I think about it, but at the time I was hoping they'd just throw him out. I heard someone shout, I'll blow you away, or something like that. And I realised that what I thought would have been a stick was probably a shotgun. It looked like they had a shotgun with them.
This altercation led to Noye stabbing John Fordham 10 times. 5 times in the front and 5 times in the back. It was a brutal stabbing when you consider that the argument he would take to court would be self-defense.
And then as soon as I radioed then action, everyone started then and the flying squad went in. John knew he'd been stabbed and he told the surveillance officer who was trying to resuscitate him that Noye had stabbed him. John was getting a lot of care and people were trying their best to help him. Got 10 holes in his body. We got to the hospital and of course John was whisked off, which is the last time I saw him. We were waiting to hear how John was, and eventually we were told he died, he was dead.
The only thoughts I have are for John's family. I think about them quite a lot and how they've missed all the years that they haven't had with him.
When John Fordham was killed that night, I knew that this was the end of any chance we ever had of recovering any of the gold. I thought that part of the Brinks-Mat robbery died, or the investigation died, with John, frankly.
This was a big loss for the police, and one that they wouldn't soon forget. This put the police on a warpath, and they began arresting as many people as they could. Kenny Noye even tried to use a secret Freemason handshake on the police, but that didn't quite work. He picked the wrong police officers to try deal with.
There was no deal to be done, as far as I was concerned. He killed a policeman.
10 months later, the trial for Noye would begin at the Old Bailey in London.
Any case which involves the death of a police officer, you always start 2 down to start with.
Somebody attacks a police officer with a knife and stabs him 11 times to death, and an unarmed police officer. And I think that if you just string those few facts together, the general perception is, well, how can there be any justification for that?
But on the other hand, the evidence was such in that case that right from the outset, having seen the prosecution evidence, I was very satisfied that he had a legitimate self-defense.
Well, he was fighting for his life. He wasn't fighting for his gold. I was in the house as well. He was fighting for me.
And we persuaded the judge to allow the jury to go down after court one evening in the dark to see the setup there and what this would have been like.
This evening, under heavy guard, Noye himself came here to view the house and grounds, along with the judge and jury.
And somebody was dressed up in that way and appeared from round the corner with the wind howling and the moon flitting through the trees, and I tell you, put the fear of God into everybody.
I think our only hope was that a jury would think that 11 stab wounds, or 10 or 11 stab wounds to the body, to John's body, was excessive.
It was a trial which had really gone quite well, and he was totally confident he was going to be acquitted.
Kenny Noye was stunningly found not guilty. He managed to convince the jury that it was self-defense. This guy knew how to work the system.
It took the jury of 7 men and 5 women 12.5 hours to reach their verdict of not guilty. When the verdict was announced, Noye and Reader shouted to the jury, "God bless you all." Kenneth Noye added, "That's what I am, not guilty."
I mean, was he a burglar? He didn't know he was a policeman.
The jury were in a difficult position, and they chose to believe that, police officer acted lawfully in the grounds of a property, receives 10 stab wounds, and that's lawful.
And I think it was the right result.
I thought it absolutely marvellous. I never ever doubted my husband's innocence.
It was unbelievable. We're absolutely sure that this was going to be a guilty.
Thank you. It seems amazing that an unarmed man can be stabbed 11 times and a jury can find that that's a justifiable killing.
Mrs. Noye has said that she would like people to spare a thought for you and offers her sympathy to you. What's your reaction to receiving those sympathies?
Not accepted.
It was certainly a turning point for me. After he died, I and all those officers with me were determined to follow this thing through to the end.
As I said earlier, though, the police wouldn't soon forget. and now they would decide to take Kenny Noye down by any means necessary. And at his home they had found 11 gold bars and, crucially, many A24 serial numbered £50 notes.
The search also found a Guinness Book of Records, and in it, the world's biggest robbery, the Brinks-Mat robbery, is circled.
He was rearrested for handling stolen money and gold, but Noye was confident. He thought, after a murder charge, how difficult would it be to get off this one?
I mean, his face used to change in a flash. Sort of this tough mask would come down and you can see him killing somebody. The next moment he's an absolute charmer, you know.
Noye is jailed for 13 years and fined £250,000 for the bullion.
He screams at the jury, I hope you all die of cancer.
There was some justice for the death of John Fordham, I think, more than anything else.
So that didn't quite go to Noye's original plan.
This time, Brenda and Noye's cronies were lost for words, though one friend did express his frustrations to the media.
Police officers have a phrase, but they will come again. If someone gets away with it at court where police officers feel they were guilty or know they were guilty and they walk away with it, we expect that they will reoffend and be convicted next time. So justice, in the end, usually works out.
After all this, though, the police had realised that the idea of chasing the gold was realistically out the window, and they had to change tact and chase the money itself.
We knew that the chances of us ever recovering any more gold were minimal, because our lines of inquiry regarding gold and how it was getting to Noye's house unfortunately had died with John Fordham.
It became evident to the police that they needed to really try and chase this money down now as much as possible, given that clearly from what they'd already seen, it was inevitable that more and more criminals would end up just getting involved as time passed.
This robbery's been a watershed, I think, for London armed robbers, because the vast amount of money has been more than they've ever known how to handle. When your share of a robbery might be £2, £3, £4 million, then for these traditionally working class robbers, then it's quite a shock, and they found themselves having to get into bed with another class of criminal.
So they brought in specialists and began to dive into the tidal wave of money that had gone in and out of the Bristol branch of Barclays.
A tidal wave of money, much of it from the sale of the gold back to Johnson Matthey, surged through this branch of Barclays, the bank Scadlins used.
What went on at that Barclays branch in Bedminster in Bristol really beggars belief. You have a little bank in a very poor area of Bristol, and in 4 months they pour through their doors £10.5 million in cash to the people from Scadlins. The turnover, the accounts of Scadlins had not been in particularly large figures before. This sudden tide of money just washes through, and you wonder why their suspicions really weren't aroused a lot earlier.
Certainly, it was something that concerned me. At first, I couldn't understand why a bank manager or a bank would hand out millions of pounds over the counter in cash and not be suspicious. Certainly, I now understand that banks are constrained by their relationship with their client and the Bankers Act. However, I'm sure it is a matter for concern.
No one raised an eyebrow as he stacked the bundles in a cardboard box, carrying a fortune out of the bank as if it were so many groceries from the corner shop.
And they soon found that it wasn't just that one branch or that one bank that was turning a blind eye to criminal money.
Noye used another bank in Croydon to look after the cash that came back from Bristol. Altogether, he moved £3.5 million to bank accounts in Dublin and Switzerland after depositing briefcases full of money. The bank unwittingly allowed him to use a false name to transfer £1.5 million to Dublin.
Scadlin boss Garth Chappell's got 10 years in prison for handling stolen money. Brian Reader ended up getting 9 years for handling stolen gold. The police now would begin to chase down and see where these A24 notes led.
I know when my husband done any dealings, he insisted on new £50 notes in sealed bags because there was a lot of forgeries about and he didn't want to end up with any of those. That was the main reason, and that they're easier to handle.
The police then began to chase the notes themselves using the serial numbers and kind of string along as many accounts as they could from the original one.
It's just a case of tracking from the bank accounts where each deposit went, where it came from in the first place.
But these were really sophisticated criminals.
On the first day of 1984, the abandoned getaway vehicle was found. The police realised its significance immediately.
A few weeks before the robbery, after it had been stolen, it had been spotted bearing false number plates in a street directly opposite Blue Cars, a minicab company owned by Brian Perry.
They found out that the laundering had essentially gone through a network. Scadlin first getting the original cash after handling the gold. They took their cut of the VAT. Then that money would be passed on to Noye, who would skim his amount off the top for kind of handling the whole thing and putting together the entire operation. And then the rest would go to Brian Perry, who was overseeing the entire operation for the original criminals and making sure that Noye and everyone else kept their end of the deal. Perry originally ran an escort ring and had a legitimate cab company, which I think fairly obviously was a way to launder money from his illegal dealings.
He didn't ever quite like to admit that the prostitutes were prostitutes. I think he used a euphemism for them, escort girls or whatever he would have called them. He was an impressive man. I would say he was quite a gentleman villain. He was professional to his fingertips. He was shrewd, but a very good sense of humour, a gallows sense of humour.
Mickey McAvoy's mistress was the one who was keeping tabs on Perry so that McAvoy knew exactly what was happening with the money and the gold from prison.
From his cab office in South London, Perry was overseeing the movement west of each consignment of 11 gold bars.
But Brian Perry wasn't sophisticated enough to do all of this himself. So while he was quite the gentleman villain, as he was called, he did have other people come in to help him with laundering this money on a sophisticated scale. That was Gordon Parry and then, crucially, a solicitor called Michael Relton. And Relton was the guy who kind of understood the world of high finance and real estate investment with his background as a solicitor dealing with a lot of upper class people.
You have somebody unknown going into the Bishopsgate branch of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank one fine day in summer 1984 and producing over £500,000 in a suitcase and saying, please send this to Switzerland to such and such a numbered account. Sorry, can't stay, got to go. And he goes. He didn't leave a name, a number, nothing. He just comes in with the cash and it's sent off to Switzerland.
What was scary for the police is that this money was showing up everywhere, including massive real estate investments. And the police soon found out that money from the Brinks-Mat heist had been used to buy up 5 wharfs on the south bank of London, and it would go on to help develop the Docklands area of London, which is a huge part of it today.
The money from Brinks-Mat has by and large joined with the other vast quantities of illegal money going out of this country. That other money is coming from cocaine and heroin. Millions and millions of pounds.
According to police, £7 million was invested in London property deals.
I think that it's necessary that we all appreciate the potential dangers here.
Because it's undermining what we might call legitimate capital, legitimate business. Clean businessmen. Clean businessmen can't compete with dirty money because it's cheap. It didn't cost the robbers anything to get it.
Brian Perry decided to use some of these funds to upgrade his life, moving from a small terrace in South London to a Tudor mansion in Kent.
For the proceeds of the Brinks-Mat gold, the robbers chose 2 offshore islands which share the same relaxed, discreet and hospitable attitude to money. The Isle of Man was one. On the other side of the Atlantic, the British dependency of Tortola was the second. Like the gold bars, the money had to lose its identity. Travelling from the Isle of Man to the Caribbean, then invested in the United States, with its profits repatriated to Britain, the money shed its criminal fingerprints.
The scale at which these criminals, though, were investing this money was insane. They were working on a global level of laundering, and they were moving this money around the world in very sophisticated ways. This was eye-opening for the police. And one of the key figures in this the police suspected was another solicitor by the name of Patrick Diamond, and he had allegedly helped them move this money through Jersey, then out to some islands in the Caribbean, and then up through Miami, and help them then find ways to invest the laundered money in drugs and so on. So they were becoming far more sophisticated with laundering this cash.
So the Brinks-Mat loot, exhausted by seizure, smelting and sale, at last had somewhere to draw breath.
Luckily for these UK criminals, the fact that they were UK based was actually a boon for them. You see, at the time, even criminals in America were using offshore accounts in the Caribbean to wash money and then putting a lot of that money into British banks, because British banks had far less regulation than they did back home in America.
I'm extremely worried that such an amount of money that is in circulation as a result of this crime is being, in my view, used for the purchase of drugs in America for use in this country. It appalls me.
There was even rumours that Charlie Wilson, one of the great train robbers, had come into $3 million in cash, and it was invested into a drugs deal gone wrong. While all of this was happening though, and the money was moving around the world, McAvoy and Robinson were getting sick of being locked up in a cell.
McAvoy has been sentenced. He's got 25 years in prison, and he's expecting a big pot of gold when he's released.
About a year and a half into their stint in jail, McAvoy and Robinson decided that they didn't really feel like sticking out 25 years and decided it would be best to give back their share of the gold in order to get a reduced sentence or just out of prison completely. And the police were keen to do a deal.
Tony White looks like the stereotypical film extra of a robber. He's a heavy. He's not the brains behind the robbery. And the idea of Tony White being the chief negotiator for Mickey McAvoy was almost ridiculous.
Police wiretapped Mickey McAvoy and Brian Robinson's men, who went to meet Brian Perry and Tony White to discuss this handover.
As I said, it's been dealt for, you know. Hang on a sec, Tony. What do you mean by that? Well, it's been traded. You mean you've done a deal for it, in other words? Eh? It's all gone. It's been converted into cash. It's been dealt for. I mean, Mickey thinks he's in control of it. But he ain't. Listen, it's no good for you there trying to keep everything yourself, right?
Very quickly they were told that Mickey McAvoy and Robinson were out of touch in prison with what was going on outside.
Perry was more articulate, more confident, equally uncomfortable. And once Perry started talking, White took a back seat, and he was saying to us that, you know, whatever Mickey thinks, whatever Mickey says, you know, he's lost it. He's not there.
And McAvoy is told that there is no gold left for him outside, and that potentially his share was already gone, which you can imagine went down like a lead balloon. And McAvoy then decided to write Perry a nice friendly letter reminding him that it was his share of gold and the consequences that may arise if his share isn't there anymore.
Hello, mate. Well, you got the last letter, and you know what it is we were told by the police. I don't know what's going on here. I hope for my peace of mind you'll tell me. It's our share we're talking about. With you and Fatty out there should be no one thinking they can hold us up in here. For over a year now. I am not settled with what I am told, and that's enough with 25 years to handle. If I have to have that, I will, but I want to make sure we are not screwed and the game is played. It seems someone is getting a lot of interest. I won't have someone else keeping my share for their own needs. That would be signing their own death warrant. If they believe that we are away too long to worry about, well, it will be done for me. I have no intention of doing the full stint and not getting my money. Give my love to your family, mate. All the best, Mickey.
Here is this guy who clearly put together the work. took these guys on a successful robbery. Here he is sitting in prison, facing 25 years. Here are people on the outside who've done very nicely, thank you. Not being asked to give up their share, just being asked to give up his share that they're looking after for him, and they won't deliver. And they're saying, do your bird, the door's shut.
Concerned about this, Perry would make a mistake thanks to McAvoy that would give police their next big break. Perry would have to buy a house from McAvoy's mistress, and this would lead the police directly onto a chain of cash leading all the way back to Perry.
Kathy Meacock, the girlfriend, had moved from a council house to a nice place called Toppington Farm, which was purchased for £250,000.
When police found out that some of the Brinks-Mat money had been used to buy McAvoy's mistress a big house in the countryside, they visited the house and were given the finger pretty quickly by the mistress when they noticed that the two dogs that she owned were named Brinks and Mat. These were brazen criminals who thought they were above the law and that they could get away with literally anything. McAvoy's mistress didn't have as much luck as she thought though, and police were able to link her to the stolen cash, and she ended up getting an 18-month jail sentence.
I really do think I've got no way out from what I've heard. But really, I want you to be as strong as me when it comes to it. It really won't bother me about going away. We will get through this, won't we? We are both strong people, and we have each other.
It's not all bad news though, as McAvoy and his mistress get married in prison, and for the first time police actually have video footage of McAvoy himself.
I call upon these persons,
here present to witness,
here present to witness,
that I, Michael John McAvoy, take thee, Kathleen Sheila McAvoy,
take thee, Kathleen Sheila McAvoy,
be my lawful wedded wife.
to be my lawful wedded wife.
The purchase of the home was done by Michael Relton, and this led police directly to him, which would start leading them up the chain of cash.
Relton is arrested. Relton starts to talk to the investigators, and this property empire opens up. Something about which we knew absolutely nothing until Relton's arrest. It was very exciting, very busy period of time. It was
concerned about Michael Relton and McAvoy's mistress going to prison. Perry decided it would be a good time to move the money from his Swiss accounts into an emergency account in Liechtenstein, and then try and figure out how to repatriate this later. And that money would get caught en route, and this would lead police on to even more evidence against Perry.
The problem had been at Aachen, on the Belgian-German border, where a courier had been stopped by customs.
Police in Aachen stopped a car for checks going across a border and found £750,000 stuffed under the back seat, all of which was A24 serial numbered £50 notes. So police let him go because the link wasn't made quick enough, and the money did make it to the emergency Liechtenstein account. But once the news fed back to the police, this gave them a great link and a way to investigate further the stolen Brinks-Mat cash.
The Crown wanted Brian Perry badly because they really did think that Perry was the brains behind all this, and yet he'd managed to take a very low profile in terms of the evidence against him.
And after going through all of this, they had more than enough account details and money laundering details to arrest Brian Perry.
Crown claimed at trial that Perry had stolen part or all of McAvoy's gold, McAvoy languishing on a 25-year sentence in Leicester jail.
What they didn't realise though, and still to this day haven't 100% confirmed, is that Perry was far more involved in the Brinks-Mat crime than they expected.
I was a bit naughty. I recall going up to Perry on about the 4th or 5th day of the jury retirement, and by now everybody was very nervous, and he was pacing up and down outside the court. And I said to him, Brian, I'll bet you're more
frightened and nervous now than you were on the day of the robbery itself. And for a moment, I think he dropped his guard, and I'll never forget he said, "Too bloody right, Mr. Goldberg, too bloody right."
It's fairly obvious that Brian Perry was one of the 6 men involved in the armed robbery, but he managed to get 9 years in prison anyway for the handling of stolen funds. Years later, what will become known as the curse of the Brinks-Mat gold began to unfold. And seemingly anyone who had even sniffed the Brinks-Mat gold began to end up dead.
All these murders over this gold came about and it was put across like a warning shot to anyone that had taken money that didn't belong to them.
It seems like many of those involved in Brinks-Mat are being picked off like targets at a funfair shooting range. Renowned underworld figure Keith Headley is shot dead on his yacht in Corfu. Headley is rumoured to have been looking after some of that gold for the gang.
Donald Urquhart leaves a London pub and ends up getting shot in the back repeatedly. He was allegedly one of the men who helped to launder the stolen funds. Georgie Francis, who was allegedly involved heavily in these crimes, was shot repeatedly inside his pub, and luckily he survived.
George Francis was very lucky to escape the attempt on his life.
Accountant Terry Goodham and his girlfriend are both murdered and their bodies dumped in Epping Forest.
In 2001, a very key figure in all of this was shot dead on the streets in broad daylight, and no one was ever brought to justice for the murder of Brian Perry. One of the biggest names in all this, Goldfinger himself, John Palmer, was shot dead in 2015 inside the grounds of his own estate.
The hitman shot him 6 times with a .32 caliber pistol.
And the killer clearly was watching him as he was killed in the one area of his Essex estate that wasn't covered by CCTV cameras. So clearly this was a professional hit of someone watching him.
This was planned. They had to know his movements. He would have been subject to serious observation over a protracted period.
All of these actions and the curse of the Brinks-Mat gold began to unfold shortly after McAvoy and Robinson got out of prison. It could just be a coincidence, but in my mind it's a very unlikely one. As for the gold itself, very little was ever recovered.
As far as recovery of the gold was concerned, the 11 gold bars found at Kenneth Noye's house was the only gold ever recovered from the Bullion robbery. Now that's 11 gold bars out of 6,800 gold bars.
Between police and Lloyd's, they did manage to recover a large amount of cash through all of these accounts and properties that were invested in and so on. But of the original funds themselves, of the original gold, police were able to track down £13 million.
13 million of gold was disposed of, but that's only half. So it's pure conjecture what happened to the other half.
The jury heard that the police had traced at least half of the original haul, £13 million worth, through the coffers of Scadlins. To this day, no one knows where the other half went.
A few say large amounts of bullion were flown out of the UK. Others think the bulk of it is still hidden in Britain.
And 2 of the armed robbers were never officially identified. What makes the 13 million figure so interesting is that it is obviously exactly half of the gold. But on top of that, it appears that Noye and his crew were only ever given half of the gold to deal with. So the mystery of where the other half went and who the other armed robbers were is one that spurs on to this day. And there are so many folk legends about where it ended up. Many people believe it was flown out of the country on a flight leaving from Heathrow the morning of the robbery. Some believe that Charlie Wilson, the great train robber, was heavily involved in this. Probably not one of the robbers, but his associates were, and he took the other 13 million, which would kind of explain why he had money for that drugs deal. And others say that it was taken and buried under a swimming pool which was built over it, and that it is still somewhere in the countryside today. It's an incredible story. The Brinks-Mat gold heist, though, is one of the most incredible and brazen heists in history. The biggest gold bullion heist ever done. And if you bought gold in the UK after 1984, it is pretty likely that you bought some of the stolen Brinks-Mat gold. Incredible.
Under blue moon I saw you, so soon you'll take me up in your arms, too late to beg you or cancel it, though I know it must be the killing time, unwillingly mine. Fate up against your will, through the thick and thin, he will wait until you give yourself to him. In starlit nights I saw you, so cruelly you kissed me. Your lips a magic world, your sky all hung with jewels. The killing moon will come too soon. Fate up against your will, through the thick and thin, he will wait until you give yourself to him. Unwillingly mine. Fate up against your